A gold ring lay forgotten beneath the cold stones of the Vatican, its delicate engravings dulled by time, its weight once heavy with power. No hand wore it now, and no voice dared speak the name of the man who once ruled with it. But history remembers. He was called Alexander Sussex, a pope in title, a prince in ambition. Under his reign, the sacred halls of the Vatican did not echo with prayer. They trembled with something far more human and far more dangerous. In an age when faith guided kings and shaped empires, one man turned the seat of Christendom into a political fortress, ruled not by holiness, but by fear, favors, and family. He wasn't the first to play the game, but he played it better and darker than anyone before him. Behind closed doors, alliances were forged, vows were broken, and loyalty was bought like silk on a merchant's road. Yet what truly unsettled his enemies was not what he did in secret, but how confidently he did it in the open. This is not a legend. It's not an exaggeration. This is the true story of how one man and one family bent the church to their will. And it's only the beginning. If you think you've heard the worst of the Vatican's hidden past, you haven't. Subscribe to this channel now, because what follows will make you question not just the history of the church, but the very idea of what makes someone holy. The first door opens here, and behind it stands Alexander Sussex. By the late 15th century, Europe stood on the edge of transformation. Wars, reformations, and the growing weight of divine authority had turned kingdoms into chessboards, and the church into the most powerful player of all. Rome, once the quiet heart of Christian faith, had become something else entirely. A battlefield of influence cloaked in incense and ritual. Inside the marble halls of the Vatican, prayers echoed, but so did secret steels and ambitions far removed from Scripture. Amid this world of silk and steel rose a name, Rodrigo de Borgia. Born in 1431 in Valencia, Spain, Rodrigo came from a noble but not royal family. He wasn't raised to be a soldier. He didn't need a sword. His weapon was something sharper: canon law, politics, and the machinery of the church itself. He climbed fast. With the help of his uncle Pope Calixtus III, Rodrigo secured high office in the church early. He was appointed cardinal, then vice-chancellor of the Vatican. He studied Roman law and mastered the inner workings of ecclesiastical power. He understood one thing clearly in this world: humility gets you nowhere, but precision, influence, and knowing who to owe and when to collect, that could make you pope. And it did. But to understand what Rodrigo would become, we must first understand what the papacy had already become. The pope by this time was not merely a spiritual guide, he was a monarch. The papal states stretched across central Italy like a kingdom in its own right. The College of Cardinals resembled a senate, not a sanctuary, each member backed by families like the Orsini, Colonna Medici, or Sforza. When a pope died, the conclave was not a holy retreat. It was a war of gold and promises. Rodrigo knew how to play that war. He didn't pretend. He didn't hide. In 1492, through a careful web of bribes, alliances, and political pressure, Rodrigo Borgia was elected pope. He took the name Alexander VI, and with that coronation, the tone of an entire era changed. That same year, across the ocean, Columbus sailed west under the Spanish crown. The world was expanding, and at the center of that expanding world stood a pope who ruled not from a chapel, but from a throne surrounded by sons and daughters who would carry out his will. Yes, sons. Alexander VI had several children, not rumored, but openly acknowledged. Chief among them, Cesare Borgia, charismatic, ruthless, brilliant, and Lucrezia Borgia, used as a political pawn in marriages that bound the Pope to powerful Italian families. But what shocked many wasn't that Alexander had children. It was that he weaponized them. Cesare was elevated a cardinal, while still young, then abandoned the cassock for armor, becoming a mercenary commander feared across the peninsula. Lucrezia, meanwhile, was married 3 times, each alliance crafted to secure power and crush opposition. Under Alexander's reign, the Vatican wasn't simply corrupt. It was theatrical. Papal banquets were lavish. Titles were sold like wine. Enemies were not forgiven, they were erased. And the people of Rome, once hopeful that a Spaniard might reform the Curia, now whispered rumors of poisonings, hidden vaults, and deals signed in candlelight. Yet the most dangerous part, it worked. For a time, Alexander VI held together a fragile, volatile Italy. He kept kings guessing, nobles begging, and armies divided. He used God's name, but the voice that echoed through the Vatican belonged to Rodrigo, not to heaven. He didn't inherit a pure church and corrupt it. The rot was already there in the marble, the robes, the rings. Alexander simply knew how to use it. And in doing so, he built something terrifying, not a papacy ruled by sin alone, but a papacy that made sin feel like strategy. To understand the tragedy that followed, we must first accept this truth. Alexander VI wasn't a mistake. He was inevitable, and the game he played was only beginning. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica rang out like they always had. But in the months after Alexander VI's coronation, their tolling seemed heavier, not with reverence, but with calculation. Inside the Vatican, silence was rare. The footsteps of servants, the hurried whispers of emissaries, the shuffling of parchment, the clinking of coins. It was a palace no longer of peace, but of politics. Every corridor was watched. Every conversation might be overheard. And at the heart of it all sat the Pope Rodrigo Borgia, robed in white, surrounded by black intentions. He wasted no time. Within weeks of his election, Alexander VI began restructuring the papal court. Loyalists were promoted. Enemies were pushed to the margins. And most significantly, he drew his family, the Borgias, deeper into the halls of divine authority. For most popes, even acknowledging illegitimate children would be scandal enough. But Alexander did more than acknowledge them. He empowered them. Cesare Borgia, his second son, was the first piece placed on the board. At just 17, he was made bishop. At 18, an archbishop. By 20, he was a cardinal dressed in red silk, seated among old men who had spent decades climbing the ladder Cesare had vaulted in months. His appointment wasn't subtle, nor was it meant to be. It was a signal. The Borgias were not merely rising, they were taking control. But Cesare wasn't built for the cloth. While he wore the vestments of a prince of the church, his soul burned for something else: power, glory, victory. He was educated, charismatic, dangerously intelligent, and deeply aware of the hypocrisy he embodied. To him, the church was not sacred, it was strategy. Behind the scenes, Alexander began orchestrating alliances across the Italian states. Marriages were arranged with precision. Lands were promised. Favors were traded like relics. Lucrezia Borgia, only a teenager, was married to a noble from the powerful Sforza family of Milan, a union meant not for love, but for leverage. She became a living contract wrapped in silk and silence. But not everyone bent the knee. Power always invites resistance. And for the Borgias, resistance would come from all sides: rival families, like the Orsini and Colonna, reformist voices inside the church, even former allies who now saw too clearly what Rome was becoming. In 1494, just 2 years into Alexander's reign, the illusion of stability began to shatter. King Charles VIII of France invaded Italy, under the guise of claiming the throne of Naples. He marched his armies south with speed and precision, toppling cities and installing fear wherever he went. The Italian states panicked, and for the first time the Vatican stood in true danger. Alexander's response was not one of prayer. It was negotiation, deception, delay. He initially welcomed Charles to Rome, promising neutrality, safety, cooperation. But behind closed doors, he worked to undermine the French campaign. Rome became a city of masks, smiling diplomacy on the surface, while underground meetings mapped out betrayals. Cesare played a vital role during these negotiations, acting as his father's envoy, and according to some accounts, ensuring certain complications never left their cells alive. It was during this crisis that Cesare began shedding the skin of a cleric. The red robes no longer suited him. He wanted something else: a sword. And he would get it, but not yet. For now, The Borgias survived the French invasion. Charles eventually withdrew his army, weakened, his ambitions stalled. But the cost of survival was high. Rome was no longer just corrupted, it was exposed. The myth of papal sanctity had been pierced. And worse, the Borgias had tasted blood. The victory changed them. From this point forward, Alexander no longer played defense. He would expand. He would conquer. Through Cesare, through Lucrezia, through coin and cruelty, he would ensure that the papacy was not just spiritual, it would be dynastic. He began granting Cesare land and titles, slowly preparing for his transformation. But before that could happen, there was another move to make, one that shocked even seasoned Roman schemers. In 1497, Giovanni Borgia, the Pope's other son, was found dead in the Tiber River. No witnesses, no suspects, no answers. Only a fine cloak, soaked in water and blood floating like a broken flag of nobility. Rumors erupted instantly. Some blamed rival families. Others whispered Cesare's name. Why would a brother kill his own kin? Why would a cardinal turn to murder? Perhaps because Giovanni was in the way. Some said Giovanni was the favored son, a duke, a commander, a noble of high ambition. But Cesare had a fire Giovanni lacked. And fire, when cornered, consumes everything, even blood. Alexander was shattered. For days he refused to eat. He wept openly, calling for justice. But no investigation followed. No arrests were made. And within weeks the matter was buried along with Giovanni. And then Cesare did the unthinkable. He renounced his position as cardinal. He took off the red robes and demanded a title of nobility, a path to power through conquest, not through faith. It was unprecedented. A cardinal stepping down was almost unheard of. But Alexander granted it, not out of grief, but out of belief. Belief that Cesare could do what no pope had dared, before carve out a secular empire with sword and strategy under the banner of the Borgia name. And so began the next phase of the Borgias' rule, not in the chapels of Rome, but in the fields of battle. But war, unlike diplomacy, does not forget, nor does it forgive. And the enemies of the Borgia were only just beginning to gather. By 1498, Cesare Borgia was no longer a man of God, at least not in the way the Church had once imagined. With his cardinal's robes cast aside, he stepped onto the world stage as something far more dangerous, a prince, without scruples, an heir, without borders. He received the title Duke of Valentinois from the French crown, securing a powerful alliance that would supply him not only with legitimacy, but with troops. Armed and armored Cesare set his sights on central Italy, where scattered lords, fractious city-states, and petty tyrants clung to power like candles in the wind. He would extinguish them one by one. His campaign was swift and brutal. Towns fell, castles were stormed. Rivals who once dined with the Borgias were dragged into the streets or disappeared behind locked doors. Through calculated terror and irresistible charm, Cesare became a symbol, to some of unshackled strength, to others of unchecked madness. And behind him always was the Vatican. Alexander VI, now in his late 60s, wielded papal authority like a blacksmith's hammer. He excommunicated enemies who opposed Cesare. He absolved allies who aided in conquest. He granted indulgences in exchange for troops and sold spiritual titles like tokens in a merchant's hand. What once had been sacred became currency. What once had been eternal became transactional. But power once fed demands more. The Pope's ambition turned toward unifying the papal states under his son's control, not merely in spirit, but in force. The idea was revolutionary. For centuries, the Vatican had played a delicate game holding political sway while pretending detachment. But now, under the Borgias, it was openly building an empire, and the world noticed. In Florence, a quiet war of words brewed. The Dominican friar Girolamo Savonarola had long warned of corruption within the Church. His sermons condemned Rome's extravagance and the moral decay at its center. Though not naming Alexander directly, his meaning was clear. At first, the Pope ignored him, but when Savonarola began rallying crowds, burning vanities in the square, and challenging the papal legates in public. Rome acted. Alexander excommunicated him. Florence hesitated, then broke. Savonarola was arrested, tortured, and ultimately hanged and burned in the Piazza della Signoria in 1498. His ashes scattered in the Arno, so no relics would remain. The message was simple: holiness without obedience meant nothing. Back in Rome, the papal court grew stranger by the day. Foreign ambassadors reported an atmosphere more akin to that of a royal court than a holy see. Diplomats spoke of masked balls, hunting parties, and secret gatherings where politics mixed freely with pleasure. The lines between power and indulgence blurred until they vanished entirely. Lucrezia Borgia, too, began to play a more active role. Her first marriage had been annulled by papal decree, declared unconsummated despite years of union. Her second husband, Alfonso of Aragon, was of noble blood but politically inconvenient. In 1500, he was attacked on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, allegedly by Cesare's men. Though he survived the first assault, he was later strangled in his chambers again, allegedly under Cesare's orders. Lucrezia, devastated, was nonetheless forced to marry again, this time into the powerful Este family of Ferrara. It was another strategic move, another contract written in names, not hearts. Each move strengthened the Borgia hold on Italy. But with every victory, they made new enemies. Families displaced, nobles humiliated, states forced to kneel, and not all grudges were short-lived. In 1502, Cesare invited several of his most powerful rivals, the Vitelli, the Orsini, and others, to a remote castle in Sinigaglia, under the pretense of negotiation. They arrived hopeful, perhaps even convinced that peace was finally possible. They were wrong. One by one, Cesare arrested them. Some were executed on the spot. Others were dragged away in chains, never to be seen again. Machiavelli, who witnessed this, would later write of Cesare, with a mix of fear and admiration, using him as the inspiration for The Prince. A man who knew how to wield cruelty with precision, who understood that fear often lasted longer than love. But even fear has its limits. By 1503, Alexander VI's health began to fail. Whether due to poison illness or simply age, his strength waned. Rome held its breath. For so long, he had been the sun around which the Vatican orbited. Without him, what would remain? In August, both Alexander and Cesare fell suddenly ill after dining at a cardinal's villa. Some said it was fever. Others whispered darker things, that the Borgias had tried to poison someone else and drank from the wrong cup. Alexander never recovered. On August 18, 1503, Pope Alexander VI died. The Vatican went quiet. No grand funeral. No procession of mourning. His body, bloated and discolored from the sudden illness, was hurriedly placed in a coffin too small to contain him. The details were hushed, the room was emptied, and the legacy of the most controversial pope in history was left to rot with him. Cesare survived, but barely. He lost his strength, his allies, and, soon after, his empire. Without the pope, he was no longer the hand of God. He was just another man, hated and hunted. Rome, once dressed in Borgia gold, now turned cold and gray. And thus ended the reign of Alexander VI. Not with fire or glory, but with decay, silence, and a legacy so stained it would echo through centuries of shame. They said it began with sweat, not the noble kind, the kind that glistens after a speech or a sermon, but the cold kind, the kind that seeps through silk robes at dusk and smells faintly of rot, the kind that belongs not to a pope, but to a man unraveling. In early August of 1503, Pope Alexander VI, nearing 72, looked exhausted. His face, once vibrant with the color of Spanish wine, had turned sallow. His eyes, always calculating, grew watery, unfocused. He coughed when he blessed, staggered when he stood. Rome whispered. The Borgia sun, long feared and worshipped, was beginning to set. And then came the dinner. A cardinal's villa outside Rome. A warm summer evening. A simple meal served with wine and quiet flattery. Alexander and Cesare attended together. There was no warning, no sudden shift in atmosphere. No cries, no gasps, just a silence followed by sweat. That night, both father and son fell ill. Terribly, violently ill. Some blamed spoiled food. Others spoke of malaria. But many, far too many, believed otherwise. That the Borgias had intended poison for someone else at the table, and drank from the wrong cup. What followed was not quick. Alexander convulsed. His skin burned with fever, then turned cold. His stomach bloated unnaturally. His lips cracked. His breath rattled, not as a prayer, but like a dying engine, stuttering toward silence. Doctors were summoned. They bled him, cupped him, prayed over him. None of it helped. The illness was relentless, and it was ugly. For days, Alexander lay on his back in the apostolic palace, murmuring half-coherent commands, sometimes mistaking the faces of his cardinals for ghosts. He clutched at the cross on his chest, not with faith, but with fear. Cesare, also ill, was unable to rise from bed. The strongest man in Rome reduced to a trembling, vomiting husk. The Borgia Empire, so carefully constructed, now lay scattered across the marble floors, waiting for a single bell to toll. On the evening of August 18th, Alexander VI died. No hymn was sung. No candles lit the room. His body, left for hours without proper preparation, began to swell. The heat of the Roman summer quickened the rot. His features distorted. His skin turned dark, leathery. When attendants finally returned to dress the body, some recoiled. Others crossed themselves. The coffin prepared for him was too small. When they forced his remains inside, the skin split. There was no grand procession, no papal fanfare. The streets of Rome, once trembling under the might of the Borgias, stood still. The crowds, who might once have gathered to weep or praise, stayed away. Only a handful of guards priests and a few reluctant cardinals accompanied the body to the crypt. Some said the silence was respect. Others said it was fear. Most agreed it was relief. The Pope was dead. The sins had been paid for, not with penance, but with decay. And yet, death did not mean escape. The rumors swirled like incense. They said his spirit haunted the papal chambers. That blood seeped from the walls where he signed his darkest orders. That the very air of the Borgia apartments grew thick, as if still holding the weight of ambition never repented. But the Vatican had no time for ghosts. A conclave must be called. Power does not wait for morning. Cesare, barely recovered, scrambled to secure the College of Cardinals. He needed a successor who would protect the Borgia legacy. But time had betrayed him. His illness had weakened him too much. Allies turned distant. Enemies came out from shadow. In a single breath, everything the Borgias had built, the alliances, the armies, the terror, began to crumble. And in the shadows of Rome, families once silenced now sharpened their knives. Cesare Borgia once stood at the center of Rome's storm, untouchable. But after his father's death, the winds shifted. His hands, once kissed by nobles and feared by soldiers, now trembled with weakness. His eyes, which once surveyed battlefields with surgical precision, blinked under the weight of betrayal. Without Alexander VI, Cesare wasn't a prince, he was a liability. And everyone knew it. The College of Cardinals moved swiftly. A conclave was called. And despite Cesare's desperate maneuvering, his candidate, a pliable, sympathetic cardinal, failed to win the majority. Instead, the papacy passed into the hands of Pope Pius III. But he ruled for less than a month before dying, possibly of natural causes, though Rome had stopped believing in coincidence. The next Pope, Julius II, was a different creature altogether. A warrior pope, and more importantly, a sworn enemy of the Borgias. Cesare was cornered. His allies evaporated. The lands he conquered with blood were seized. Fortresses rebelled. Soldiers defected. Contracts were torn. Whispers of revenge spread like mold through crumbling palaces. Even the Este family, Lucrezia's final in-laws, began to distance themselves from the Borgia name. There was no final battle, no heroic last stand. Cesare was captured and imprisoned in Spain. For months he languished in a castle far from the Roman corridors he once ruled. His letters begged for release, for return, for another chance. But history has no mercy for fallen monsters. only curiosity. When he finally escaped and joined the service of a foreign king, it was not redemption he sought, but purpose. Something to cling to, something to kill for. In 1507, Cesare Borgia died in battle, ambushed while fighting for Navarre. His body was stripped by enemies, left unburied on the field. When the locals finally returned him to the earth, it was without ceremony, a shallow grave near a church, far from the gold and marble of Rome. They say his bones were once walked over by villagers, until the church deemed it improper and moved his remains. But the stain he left on the Vatican was not so easily moved. Back in Rome, the Borgia name was erased from paintings, from plaques, from memory. Apartments were repainted, walls replastered, coins melted. It was as if the Vatican itself had exhaled, expelling the decade of shadow that had darkened its soul. Lucrezia lived longer, more quietly. Her name softened with time. Her portrait grew less scandalous, her correspondence more poetic. She became a duchess, a mother, a woman cloaked not in shame, but in ambiguity, a symbol of a time people tried hard to forget, and yet never truly could. Because the legacy of Alexander VI was not buried with him, it lingered. In every papal scandal that followed, in every accusation of corruption, of nepotism, of indulgence, sold for coin, he had set a precedent that the throne of St. Peter could be claimed by ambition, by blood, by strategy, not just by divine will. Even centuries later, during the fires of the Protestant Reformation, Martin Luther would cite the Borgias as proof of rot, using their sins as ammunition against the Church. Alexander VI became not just a man, but a symbol, a warning, a curse. And yet he was also something more unsettling. He was human, flawed, calculating, fiercely loyal to his blood. A man who saw the Church not as sacred, but as a crown waiting to be worn, and wore it unapologetically. He didn't pretend to be holy. He pretended to be invincible. And for a time, he was. But all reigns end. And when his did, it left behind no altar, no monument, no elegy. Only a ring buried in stone. Only silence. Only a question. What happens when God's house belongs to men like these? And in that silence, the story of Alexander VI lives on, not as a saint, not as a martyr, but as a mirror held up to power, the kind of mirror that never forgets what it saw. History, like a patient sculptor, knows how to chip away names. And the Vatican, too, learned how to bury its past, not with earth, but with silence. After the death of Alexander VI, there was no official condemnation, no heresy trial, no public penance. Just a quiet campaign of forgetting. The Borgia apartments were repainted, their symbols scraped from stone, their names erased from official records where possible, replaced with vague euphemisms, or left out entirely. Even in the Vatican's own archives, decades would pass before scholars could speak the Borgia name without a hushed tone or a trembling sigh. It was as if the Church itself recoiled from what had been allowed, and then acted as though it had never happened. But forgetting is not the same as forgiving. Alexander VI's legacy lived on in whispers, in paintings and the choices of popes who came after him. He became a reference point, a cautionary tale. His reign was not simply a period of corruption, but a mirror that reflected how far power can stretch when left unchecked even in the holiest of places. And yet, paradoxically, his story also shaped the very reforms meant to prevent another Borgia. The Protestant Reformation that tore through Europe decades later found one of its loudest arguments in Rome's past sins. Martin Luther himself pointed to the papacy of Alexander VI, a man who had fathered children, sold indulgences, played kings, like pieces on a chessboard as proof that the Church had lost its way. His very existence became a rallying cry for those who believed salvation could no longer come from Rome. Even within the Catholic Church, his reign was a catalyst. Later, popes men like Paul III, Pius V, and others would enact reforms, redefine the College of Cardinals, and attempt to restore spiritual integrity to the Vatican. But the stain was there, woven into the marble, whispering through the Sistine corridors. Outside the Church, the Borgia name passed into myth. Artists painted Lucrezia as both sinner and saint. Writers turned Cesare into a tragic hero, a man too bold for his time. And Alexander, the father, the pope, the kingmaker, became a symbol of ambition without apology. Niccolò Machiavelli, in his famous The Prince, used Cesare as the model of ruthless efficiency. But read closely, and the shadow of Alexander is there too, a man who understood that to govern the world, one must be willing to play with fire and not flinch when it burns. Over time, the horror softened into fascination. The Borgias inspired operas, novels, television series, their sins reborn as drama, their cruelty dressed in silk and candlelight. History turned them into characters, and in doing so sometimes forgot the real victims. The towns raised the rivals, assassinated the souls sold for power. Still, something remained. In the Vatican today, the Borgia apartments still stand, hidden from public tours, preserved more as curiosity than reverence. The frescoes on the walls, painted at Alexander's command, still gleam with color. Cherubs and saints gaze down, unblinking, as if unaware of the corruption that once sat beneath their painted eyes. But you can't whitewash memory, not truly. Because Alexander VI forces us to ask uncomfortable questions not just about faith, but about power itself. Can a man be both spiritual leader and political titan? Can holiness survive ambition? Can any institution, no matter how sacred, resist the seduction of unchecked control? And perhaps, most disturbingly, was Alexander VI an aberration, or simply the most honest reflection of his time? His reign ended in decay, his legacy stained and scattered, but the lessons he left behind are immortal. He reminds us that evil does not always scream. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it wears robes, sometimes it blesses with one hand while sealing your fate with the other. History did not mourn him, but it remembers him. And in that memory, raw, uncomfortable, and unerasable, we find the echo of a truth no church, no crown, no empire can ever bury for long. If you thought this story was dark, wait until you meet the woman they called the Bride of Christ, who ruled Florence through fear, seduction, and a crown not given by God but stolen from the dead. The Vatican's shadows didn't end with Alexander VI. They only deepened. So if you're ready to keep digging to open doors that history tried to seal shut, follow this channel. Subscribe. There are more secrets waiting, more names history tried to erase, and more truths that were never meant to be told. Click here to watch the next story. But take a breath first, because once you enter this world, there's no going back.